Hey guys, tonight we walk out onto the Giza plateau like it is happening right now, with warm sand under your shoes and that dry desert air that feels like it has been politely microwaved. The pyramids sit ahead of you in the dark like huge sleeping animals, and even when you have seen them 100 times in photos, your brain still does that little reboot where it quietly says, okay, that is not normal. Most historians agree these monuments belong to Egypt's Old Kingdom, but as you get closer you start to notice how many questions still float around the edges. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, what if imagination. You are not here to prove anything. You are here to drift through clues because, honestly, you probably will not survive this night if your plan is to stay awake and act like a serious detective the whole time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time in the comments, because I like imagining this as a big, quiet campfire that just happens to involve 2.3 million stone blocks. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of the plateau where the modern world fades in small reluctant steps. A distant road hums faint as a refrigerator in another room. Somewhere behind you, Cairo breathes with its own rhythm, but out here the night is wider and the air seems to listen. The first thing you notice is scale. Not the kind you understand with numbers, but the kind you feel in your ribs. The Great Pyramid rises so high it turns the sky into a backdrop. The stones are stacked in courses that look almost calm from far away, like layers of a carefully folded blanket. Up close, the blocks look like they could have their own postal codes. Most historians agree the three main pyramids at Giza were built during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, often connected to the kings Khufu Khafre and Menkaure. Archaeology suggests this was a time when royal power, resources and administration could be focused into a single massive project, like a national obsession carved into limestone. That is the solid ground. That is the part you can put your feet on without wobbling. And yet, you are not here tonight for only the solid ground. You are here for the mist that clings around it. The question in the title is not a claim, it is a mood. Evidence of a lost civilization before the Pharaohs. You can almost hear the phrase being whispered in documentaries, half invitation and half dare. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You take a slow walk forward, letting your eyes adjust. The moonlight makes the limestone look pale and slightly blue, like old bone, but not in any creepy way. More like the colour of a seashell. The sand is cooler at night and it shifts underfoot in a soft dry hush that feels like the desert is trying not to wake the pyramids. What's broadly accepted is that Giza was chosen carefully. It is close to the ancient capital region near the Nile floodplain, but high enough to feel eternal. The plateau is solid bedrock, which is exactly what you would want if you are going to build something that has to resist time and gravity and the occasional human with a chisel. The evidence we do have points to practical thinking. This is not a magic spot. It is a good building site. One interpretation is that the very practicality of the choice can blur another possibility. Practical places often get used again and again. Humans tend to return to the same good ground, like pigeons returning to the same statue. If a ridge is stable and near water and has quarry stone nearby, you do not just use it once and then swear a vow never to come back. So it is possible that before the famous 4th Dynasty projects, the plateau could have seen smaller activity, early quarrying, early shrines, early experiments, maybe nothing dramatic, but something. And then the cinematic what if sneaks in soft as a blanket. What if your first steps tonight are crossing a place that was already meaningful, already worked, already tested long before a king's name got attached to it? You stop near the base of the Great Pyramid and let your hand hover near the stone. The block face is not smooth. It is textured with age, with tiny pits and faint tool marks and edges that have softened into gentler angles. The stone holds the day's heat like a memory. If you press your palm to it, it is not cold, not even close. It is warm, the way a brick wall can be warm long after sunset. Archaeology suggests the pyramids were once clad in fine casing stones that made the sides smooth and reflective, turning them into bright geometric mountains. The idea that they gleamed is not just romantic, it fits with what we know about the materials and the pieces that remain. But you are standing beside the rough core blocks now, and the pyramid feels less like a polished symbol and more like a working structure, like the world's largest piece of masonry that never got to finish dressing for the party. A careful reading might suggest that this gap between the original finish and the present roughness is part of why the lost civilization rumour sticks. When something looks unfinished or damaged, your mind fills the gaps with stories. And if you do not know all the steps that took it from gleaming to weathered, your imagination slides in and tries to complete the sequence. You keep walking slow enough that your breath stays calm. The night wind is light just enough to move the fine sand along the ground in thin drifting sheets. It makes a faint scratchy sound like someone brushing flour off a countertop. You picture workers doing exactly that, brushing stone dust off their arms, off their shoulders, off their hair, because ancient construction is basically the world's longest messy kitchen shift. Most historians agree the pyramid building workforce was not a single crowd of enslaved people chained in misery, as older popular images often suggested. The evidence we do have points to organised labour provisioning and a system that could feed and house thousands of workers. That does not mean it was a vacation. It means it was planned. It was managed. It was a society choosing to spend enormous effort on a monument. One interpretation is that the real wonder is not only the stones, but the administration behind them. To cut, move, and set blocks on this scale, you need schedules, rations, specialised teams, supervisors, and a kind of calm, stubborn coordination. You need the ancient version of clipboards, except the clipboard is in someone's head and the paper is a mental list that says bring more bread, bring more beer, bring more rope, stop losing the rope, seriously, who keeps losing the rope? Now the cinematic what if comes in again, but gently. What if the administration that makes the pyramids possible did not appear overnight? What if it was the peak of something older, a long learning curve that started earlier than we normally picture? Not a vanished super civilization with laser tools, just a gradual build-up of skill and organization that left faint footprints we do not always see. You pause and look out across the plateau. The other pyramids sit farther away, each with its own silhouette, each with its own personality. Menkaures looks smaller, but only in the way a mountain looks smaller when it is next to a taller mountain. The sheer presence of 3 huge pyramids in one landscape can make your brain search for a bigger story to match the bigness. Historians still argue whether the plateau's full sequence of construction and modification can be traced cleanly from the evidence we have, or whether some features might have been reused, repaired, or adapted in ways that blur the neat lines of timeline charts. That sentence is important tonight. You say it to yourself like a slow mantra, not because it proves anything, but because it creates honest space. A timeline can be broadly correct and still have gaps. A culture can be well documented and still have missing chapters. Most historians agree on the central story. Scholars continue to debate some details. You start moving again, angling toward a point where the ground rises slightly and gives you a wider view. As you walk, you notice the plateau does not feel like a blank stage with pyramids dropped on top. It feels like terrain with history in its shape. The rock has natural ridges and cut edges. Some areas look quarried, carved away, leaving flat faces like open pages. Archaeology suggests quarrying happened right here, close to the building sites, because moving stone a short distance is easier than dragging it across the world. That is the kind of practical logic that makes ancient people feel suddenly familiar. You can almost hear an ancient foreman saying, "Why would we haul it from far away when the good stuff is right here?" And then someone else nodding like, "Yes, thank you. That is literally why we have knees." One interpretation is that quarrying activity can complicate the idea of what came first. When you cut into a landscape, you raise earlier surfaces, you remove layers, you reshape the ground. So it is possible that if there was earlier activity on parts of the plateau, later quarrying could have trimmed it away, like someone sanding down an old scratch on a table. Not because anyone was hiding it, just because construction is naturally destructive. And then softly, the cinematic what if again. What if the plateau once held smaller monuments, older shrines, or early experiments that were sacrificed to make space for the bigger plan? What if the 4th dynasty builders arrived and found a place already marked by human hands, then simply decided their story would be the one written in giant letters? You take another breath, slow and steady. The air smells faintly mineral, like dry stone warmed by sun and now cooling under moonlight. There is also a distant hint of city dust. It is not romantic perfume. It is the smell of real place. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids are far older than the Old Kingdom, built by a lost civilization that vanished long before pharaohs, leaving only stone giants as their calling cards. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers in popular imagination because it matches the feeling you get when you stand here and realize how small you are. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The feeling of smallness is real. The leap to a lost super civilization is a possibility some people entertain, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have points strongly to Old Kingdom building. The question is whether there are earlier traces in the landscape, earlier footsteps, earlier uses that do not rewrite the story, but add a quiet prologue. You keep walking until you find a spot where the Great Pyramid blocks the wind a little. It is suddenly calmer. Your breathing feels louder, like you turn the volume up. You imagine the sound of ancient tools, the thud of stone pounders, the scrape of sledges, the shouted calls, and then you let those imagined sounds fade again until the night returns to its soft hush. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You look up at the pyramid and let the angle of it guide your eyes toward the stars. The sky over the desert has a depth that city skies rarely allow. It's not just black, it is layered. A sprinkle of lights, a band of haze, a few brighter points that seem to pulse when you stare too long. And you think calmly, not dramatically, that maybe the biggest mystery is not that we know nothing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You take one more step forward, and in your mind, the plateau becomes two things at once. A documented Old Kingdom construction site full of planning and labour, and a landscape that might have had earlier stories, quieter ones that were absorbed, reshaped and built over by later greatness. You let those two layers sit together without fighting, like sand and stone, like solid ground and mist. You keep moving, not because you are in a hurry, but because the plateau encourages a slow drift, like you are strolling through an outdoor museum where the exhibits are the size of apartment buildings. The Great Pyramid stays beside you in your peripheral vision, always there, always heavy, and the sand keeps making that soft hush under your shoes, a steady little sound that becomes your nightly metronome. Most historians agree the pyramids were built from local limestone and carefully selected stone from other sources for specific parts, and archaeology suggests the builders took advantage of what the landscape offered, including nearby quarries. That is the mainstream anchor, the part where the story smells like stone dust and hard work, not like secret portals. The evidence we do have points to practical choices, local materials, and a workforce that knew how to break a massive idea into manageable pieces. You walk toward an area where the bedrock shows cut faces as if the plateau itself has been shaved back. In the moonlight, those quarry scars look like broad, pale steps. You imagine a line of workers with stone pounders rhythmically striking, chipping away at the rock until blocks can be freed. You can almost hear the repeated thump. It is not a violent sound in your imagination. It is steady. It is the sound of long tasks that require patience, like doing dishes after a holiday meal, except the dishes weigh 2 tons. One interpretation is that quarrying is where the story gets interesting in a quiet way. When you quarry a place, you do not only take stone, you also rewrite the surface of time. You remove evidence of what was there before. You expose layers that were once hidden. You make the ground tell a different story than it did yesterday. So even if the pyramids are Old Kingdom, the plateau's deeper layers can still spark a separate question. What was here earlier before the quarrying, before the roads, before the grand plan? And now you let the cinematic what if float in gentle and careful. What if the plateau was not empty before the pharaohs arrived with their giant ambitions? What if small communities, early shrines, or earlier builders used this same good rock and left traces that were later cut away, buried, or simply missed? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Right now, the strongest evidence ties the major construction to the Old Kingdom. The lost civilization idea is the misty edge. Still, your mind is allowed to wonder without pretending it has solved anything. You stop near a block that lies slightly apart from the main faces, and you study it the way you would study a piece of furniture at a thrift store, trying to imagine how it got here. The surface has subtle lines, tiny grooves that could be tool marks, and the corners are softened by time. The stone looks like it has been handled by weather for a very long time, which is not exactly shocking because you are standing beside a monument that has been exposed to thousands of years of sun and wind. Archaeology suggests the builders used simple tools and clever methods, including wooden sledges, ropes, and lubrication on sand for hauling. Most historians agree copper tools were used where they made sense, and harder stone tools did the heavy pounding and shaping. That might sound underwhelming to someone hoping for space lasers, but it is also a reminder that humans can do astonishing things with simple technology when they have time labour, and the kind of stubborn determination that makes you reorganise your closet at 2 a.m. Light joke number 1 slips in here because we have to keep it cosy. You know how you sometimes promise yourself you will just clean one drawer and then suddenly you are 3 hours deep holding a random cable you do not recognise whispering, "Why do I own this?" Imagine that, but the drawer is a quarry and the random cable is a 2-ton limestone block, and you do recognise it because it is literally your whole job. As you walk, you notice that the stones are not identical. They vary subtly in size, in colour, in surface texture. The pyramid is not a perfect machine assembled from factory parts. It is a giant handmade structure. That fact is part of the mainstream story. The evidence we do have points to a human process full of adjustments, changes, and decisions made on the ground. One interpretation is that this human variability can support 2 different moods at once. On one hand, it makes the pyramid feel more plausible as an Old Kingdom project because you see the fingerprints of real work. On the other hand, it also leaves space for the idea that techniques evolved over time, that builders learned by doing, and that earlier experiments could have preceded the grand final form. Not a lost super civilization necessarily, but a longer runway of development than the neatest timelines suggest. Now you turn your attention to the small details that tend to get overlooked in big dramatic conversations. The plateau is not only pyramids, it is also cut channels, rock levels, and the faint memory of paths. You imagine workers moving along those paths, carrying tools, carrying water, carrying bread. The air would have smelled different then, not only stone and sand, but sweat and smoke, and the sour tang of fermented beer that keeps appearing in the story, like a recurring character who always shows up at the party. Most historians agree bread and beer were common staples for Egyptian workers, and archaeology suggests that provisioning large workforces required a serious logistical system. That is an anchor that keeps you grounded. Big monuments do not float into existence. They require daily planning, daily feeding, daily coordination. Historians still argue whether the earliest phases of Giza's development began as a single master plan from the start, or grew in steps with changes and additions as projects evolved. You say that sentence slowly in your mind because it matters. If planning evolved in steps, then the plateau's story is not one clean line, but a series of decisions. And whenever there are decisions, there are moments of uncertainty, moments where someone chooses option A instead of option B, and option B disappears into the dust. Those lost options can become fertile ground for later theories. A popular rumour claims that the Great Pyramid contains hidden knowledge from a vanished civilization preserved like a time capsule behind sealed stone. This rumour is not supported by strong evidence in the way people sometimes want it to be, but it persists because the pyramid's interior is mysterious by design. It is not a transparent structure. It keeps its secrets the way a closed book keeps its pages, and humans are famously unable to leave closed books alone. Second light joke because you deserve one. Humans see a closed door and immediately turn into emotionally invested raccoons. What is behind it? Probably nothing, but also maybe everything. We must check. You angle your walk so you are moving along the base and you let your eyes trace the slope upward. The pyramid looks like it is climbing into the night block by block toward a point that feels both physical and symbolic. In the silence, you can almost sense the mathematical thinking behind it, the way lines and angles were chosen carefully, not randomly. Archaeology suggests Egyptian builders had strong practical geometry and surveying skills, and most historians agree these skills were part of a broader tradition of measurement tied to agriculture, construction, and administration. That is the mainstream story again, and it fits. You do not need a lost civilization to explain a culture that measures fields, builds temples, and organizes labor. Skills accumulate in societies the way dust accumulates on shelves, slowly, steadily, and then one day you notice it everywhere. One interpretation, though, is that skills can accumulate for longer than our best documentation can show. Written records have gaps. Materials decay. Settlements get covered, eroded, rebuilt. So it is possible that earlier phases of technical practice existed without leaving obvious signatures at Giza. That is a cautious thought, not an outrageous one. And then the cinematic, what if some of the quiet techniques, the survey habits, the quarry choices began in communities older than the dynastic state, passed down in small ways, and later amplified under royal power into something colossal. You take a slow breath and let your shoulders drop. The night is doing its job. The pyramids are doing their job. They are giving your mind something vast to float around, like a raft on dark water. You step away from the stone for a moment and look at the ground. There are small fragments, chips, bits of limestone pieces broken off, over time. The plateau is not frozen, it is always changing grain by grain. And that is another reason the older than Pharaohs question is tricky. The landscape has been shaped by nature and by people. It has been quarried, built upon, visited, reused, repaired, and weathered. A more cautious explanation could be that what looks like a missing earlier chapter might simply be the result of centuries of reshaping. The plateau has had many lives. If an earlier life existed, it might be faint. If it did not exist, our minds might still imagine it, because imagination is part of how humans relate to ancient stone. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Wonder is not evidence. Wonder is a feeling. Evidence is what can be tested and compared. Tonight, you're allowed to carry both, as long as you do not mix them into one soup and call it certainty. You resume your slow walk, and the sand hush returns beneath your shoes. The pyramid stays beside you like a quiet companion. You feel the warmth of stone near your skin whenever you pass close, and you keep the question in your mind as a soft candle flame, not a spotlight. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden empire with flying machines, but a quieter truth about how humans build, how skills grow, how places get reused, how monuments can be both documented achievements and magnets for mystery. You keep walking until the Great Pyramid shifts slightly behind you, and for a moment the horizon opens. The plateau spreads out like a stony beach, and the air feels a little cooler, as if the night has finally decided to exhale. Your fan hum, if you have one on, fits perfectly here. The desert is basically the original white noise machine, except it comes with ancient architecture and a sky that refuses to stop showing off. Most historians agree the Great Pyramid is closely associated with Khufu, a 4th dynasty king, and archaeology suggests the broader complex at Giza reflects a royal program that includes temples, causeways, and supporting structures. That is your mainstream anchor again. The story is not only a big triangle of stone, it is a whole planned landscape, a carefully staged relationship between king ritual and the horizon. You turn and look back at the pyramid's face, trying to picture it as it might have looked when it was newer, smoother, more sharply edged. It is hard because time has softened it, and because your brain keeps insisting the pyramid has always been this exact way, like it arrived fully formed the same way a mummy arrives fully formed. But the evidence we do have points to changes. The casing stones, the outer polish, the missing capstone, the gradual weathering. This place has had a long life. As you drift along, you imagine the names: Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure. These names feel like labels on museum shelves, neat and tidy, but out here in the night they feel more like echoes. A name can attach to a monument and still leave 1,000 questions unanswered. One interpretation is that the most interesting evidence is sometimes not the grand inscriptions, but the small human marks left behind by workers. The evidence we do have points to teams and crews, people who hauled and cut and placed stone, and some of their traces survive in unexpected ways. Little notes, marks, bits of administrative life. They are the kind of details that make the giant pyramid feel like a job site instead of a miracle. And that is where the lost civilization question tries to slip in, because people notice a tension. If this is Khufu's pyramid, where is the big celebratory plaque saying built by Khufu? Thanks for visiting. Ancient Egypt did not always carve giant dedication signs into everything the way we might put a logo on a coffee cup. Still, the relative quietness of direct royal writing on the pyramid itself can make some people feel suspicious. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids were inherited from an earlier people and that pharaohs simply claimed them, adding names later, like someone putting their initials on a borrowed book. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the pyramids feel older than imagination can handle. They feel like they should have come from a time when humans were different. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Feeling old is not the same as being older. The mainstream view ties the pyramids to the Old Kingdom based on archaeology context and the supporting structures around them. The question is not whether the main build belongs to that era. The question you are allowing tonight is narrower and softer. Could there have been earlier activity on the plateau that shaped what came later? Could some techniques, some planning habits, some sacred meaning have deeper roots? You walk toward a place where the ground dips slightly, and you imagine the ancient city of workers nearby, alive with routine. You picture bread ovens glowing orange in the early morning, and the smell of baking mixing with dust. You picture men and women carrying baskets, water jars, bundles of reeds. You picture someone counting rations with a tired expression that says, "Yes, I know you want more, but I am literally doing math on a piece of pottery shard." Most historians agree large state projects in Egypt required bureaucracy, and archaeology suggests the Fourth Dynasty had the administrative strength to organise labour, food tools and transport. That is a big part of the real story. The pyramids are a monument to management. If you ever complain about scheduling meetings, just remember someone once had to schedule thousands of people moving rocks in the desert and then somehow make sure everyone ate dinner. Light joke number one for this section is that the pyramids might be the world's oldest proof that project management is both essential and mildly soul-draining. Somewhere in ancient Egypt, a supervisor probably stared at a pile of stone and thought this timeline is optimistic. One interpretation is that bureaucracy itself might suggest a longer development behind the scenes. Bureaucracy does not pop into existence like a sudden thunderstorm. It grows, it learns, it becomes a habit. So it is possible that the systems used at Giza were not invented in that moment, but refined from earlier practices. That is not a lost civilization claim. It is a human society claim. Skills accumulate. Administration accumulates. People get better at organising because they have organised before. And then the cinematic what if comes in softer again. What if the plateau had earlier work camps or early quarry teams in a pre-dynastic or early dynastic phase, training the muscles of organisation? What if the Great Pyramids are the climax of a story with a long, quiet introduction we rarely talk about? You stop and listen. The desert is quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing. A faint breeze moves past your ears with a soft shh sound. You can imagine it as the whisper of time if you are feeling poetic, Or you can imagine it as the desert politely reminding you to relax your jaw because you have been clenching it while thinking about ancient bureaucracy. Seriously, unclench. Your face deserves peace. Historians still argue whether the surviving written and material evidence gives us a complete picture of how royal authority and worker communities interacted at Giza, or whether key parts of that relationship are still missing. That phrase settles in. Missing parts. In the missing parts, theories grow. In the missing parts, popular rumours claim secret chambers, stolen legacies, older builders' hidden wisdom. Some of those ideas are entertaining. Some are overconfident. Tonight you are treating them like fog at the edge of a road. You notice it. You do not drive into it at full speed. You keep walking and you look again at the pyramid's masonry. You think about how a king's name can be both central and surprisingly distant. In many ancient societies, kingship is an idea as much as a person. Khufu might have overseen the project, but he did not personally lift blocks. He did not personally drag sledges. The pyramid is his monument. Yes, but also the monument of everyone who built it. A careful reading might suggest that when later people feel the pyramid does not feel like one king's work, what they are really sensing is the collective nature of the labour. A single life is short, a pyramid is long. A project that lasts years involves many hands and many changes. That does not require a lost civilization, it requires time. Second light joke, because you get one. Imagine trying to keep a modern group chat alive for 20 years, then multiply that by 1,000, and remove emojis and add limestone. The fact that anything got finished is honestly impressive. You look up at the edges, and you notice how the courses step. You picture ramps teams shouted instructions. You picture someone dropping a tool and hearing it clatter far below and everyone pausing for a second like, please do not let that be the only copper chisel we have. Most historians agree tools were limited compared to modern standards, and archaeology suggests methods relied on leveraged teamwork and repeated small actions rather than dramatic single feats. One interpretation is that repeated small actions are the secret engine of civilization. The pyramids are not a miracle. They are a habit of work repeated until it becomes a mountain. Now the cinematic what if takes a slightly different shape. What if the secret is not a lost civilization's technology, but a lost civilization's discipline? Not vanished machines, but vanished patience. A society that could commit to one long project with fewer distractions, fewer notifications, fewer blinking screens, demanding attention every 10 seconds. That thought makes you smile because it is quietly relatable. The pyramids survive because stone is stubborn, but also because humans once chose stubbornness too. You let the plateau's quiet settle into you. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You accept Khufu's shadow as part of the story, and you allow gently the possibility that the plateau's deeper human history might be longer and messier than the cleanest summaries suggest. You keep walking toward the next set of questions, carrying the sand, hush, the warm stone, and that soft, careful curiosity that does not need to shout. You wander along the base where the stone feels close enough to lean on, like a wall outside a house, except this house is roughly the size of a small mountain, and it has absolutely no interest in letting you borrow a cup of sugar. The night air stays dry and gentle. The sand shifts underfoot with that soft hush, and the pyramid blocks the wind in a way that makes you feel tucked in, sheltered by geometry. Most historians agree the builders relied on tools that sound simple by modern standards, and archaeology suggests a mix of copper tools for softer stone, harder stone, pounders for heavy work, wooden levers, ropes, and patient repetition. The evidence we do have points to a working world where skill matters as much as muscle. When you look at the blocks, you can almost feel the rhythm of the job. Strike, chip, measure, adjust. Again, again, again. You crouch a little, not because you need to, but because your body likes the idea of getting closer to detail. You imagine the tool marks, the faint scratches that might have once been sharper. You picture copper chisels biting into limestone, then slowly dulling, then being hammered back into shape, then dulled again. Copper is not steel. Copper is the friend who shows up to help you move, but needs a snack break every 12 minutes. Light joke number 1. You picture an ancient worker holding a copper chisel and thinking, this is fine, everything is fine, while the chisel looks back like, I am doing my best. Please stop asking me to be iron. Archaeology suggests dolerite pounders were used to shape granite and tougher stone, and most historians agree this kind of tool use is consistent with what we know from quarries and workshops. Granite is stubborn. It does not politely step aside for a soft metal blade. So the approach becomes one of impact and abrasion. You pound, you grind, you saw with sand as an abrasive. You drill using repeated motion and grit that does the cutting. It is less like slicing a cake and more like slowly persuading the stone to cooperate. One interpretation is that the most impressive part is not any single tool, but the system. You do not rely on one magical method. You combine methods. You use the right material for the right job. You build a workflow. Even in your own life, you know this feeling. You do not clean a whole house with one paper towel. You switch tools, switch tactics, and sometimes you just stare at the mess and hope it organises itself out of fear. Ancient builders, unfortunately, do not get that last option. You walk a little farther and imagine the quarry activity, the shaping yards, the piles of chips, the dust on skin. You picture saws made of copper that do not cut by sharpness alone, but by dragging abrasive sand back and forth until the stone yields. The evidence we do have points to this kind of abrasive cutting in ancient stonework. It is slow, but it works. Light joke number 2. You realise the pyramids might be the ultimate proof that sand is not only for beaches and awkward vacation photos. Sand is also a tool, a weapon, and a mild inconvenience that gets into your shoes and never leaves. The builders had sand everywhere, and they looked at it and said, great, we can use this. Most historians agree moving blocks required clever handling rather than raw strength alone. And archaeology suggests sledges, ramps, levers, and lubrication could reduce friction. You picture a heavy block on a wooden sledge. You picture a team pulling ropes in a steady rhythm. You picture someone pouring water onto sand to make it pack and slide more smoothly, turning the ground into a controlled surface instead of loose grains that fight every motion. One interpretation is that this is where human ingenuity feels most relatable. You do not need impossible power. You need to know how to make friction your friend. You need to understand weight and slope and timing. A careful reading might suggest that the true technology is knowledge of materials and teamwork, plus the willingness to do the same motion 10,000 times without throwing the rope into the Nile out of pure exhaustion. Now the mist comes in but gently. Some people look at the scale and precision and feel that the tools must have been better than we think. They imagine hidden devices, unknown alloys, or advanced techniques. A fringe idea proposes that the stones were moved using lost methods, like sound vibration or other dramatic forces, almost like the plateau was once a stage for secret physics. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. Still, it survives because it feels poetic. It turns labour into a spell. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream explanation can feel boring to a modern mind that expects shortcuts. But boring does not mean wrong. Boring can be accurate. The evidence we do have points to practical methods. If we treat the dramatic claims as possibility rather than conclusion, we can still enjoy the wonder without pretending it has been solved. You stand again and let your eyes travel along the courses of stone. You can almost see where blocks meet, where lines drift slightly, where adjustments were made. This is not a machine made from perfect parts. This is a human build. That fact anchors you. It also makes room for a quieter kind of mystery. Historians still argue whether the builders followed a single consistent construction method from start to finish, or adapted tools and techniques as the project rose and problems changed. That debate is important because it keeps the story flexible in the right way. It allows evolution. It allows learning. It allows the idea that the methods on day 1 might not be the methods on year 10. It allows the possibility that earlier experiments, earlier attempts, earlier training grounds shaped what becomes possible at Giza. One interpretation is that the Old Kingdom did not invent everything from nothing. Skills have roots. Quarrying has roots. Stonework has roots. It's possible that earlier communities, even before the full dynastic state, worked stone in smaller ways that do not show up as giant monuments. Maybe they cut blocks for simple structures. Maybe they shaped stone for shrines. Maybe they learned how to align and level a measure long before someone decided to stack limestone into a perfect mountain. You take a slow walk along a patch of bedrock that feels smoother underfoot. It makes you think about levelling, about how you would prepare a foundation for something this heavy. Archaeology suggests builders used levelling techniques that could involve water channels and careful measurement. Most historians agree the base of the Great Pyramid is remarkably level, which is a practical achievement that does not require magic, but does require attention. Light joke number 3. You imagine an ancient supervisor standing over the foundation with the intensity of someone hanging a picture frame at home. A tiny tilt, a deep sigh. Adjust it. Know the other way. Now it is worse. Now it is better. The difference is that here the picture frame is the Great Pyramid, and if it is crooked, it stays crooked for a few thousand years. Now the cinematic What if arrives soft as the wind that barely touches your face? What if there were older workshops nearby? Not a lost empire, but a lost chapter of practice. What if a small community of stoneworkers, long before pharaohs turned stone into state power, learned how to quarry efficiently, how to shape blocks cleanly, how to manage teams? What if those skills were inherited and amplified the way a quiet family recipe becomes a restaurant once someone finally has the money for a bigger kitchen? To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have points strongly to Old Kingdom activity at Giza. Still, the plateau is part of a longer landscape. People lived along the Nile long before the 4th dynasty. They built, they traded, they experimented. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You keep your feet on the solid ground. The pyramids are human, the tools are real, the methods are plausible. And yet you allow yourself one more calm question, one that does not demand a dramatic answer. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not at a vanished high-tech civilization, but at the deep continuity of human learning. The way knowledge can pass hand to hand, generation to generation, until one moment arrives where it can finally be used at full scale. You breathe in slow and steady. The warm stone beside you holds the day's memory. The night sky above holds its own quiet math. And you keep walking, letting the sand hush and the idea of patient tools lull your mind into a gentle, credible wonder. You wander along the base where the stone feels close enough to lean on, like a wall outside a house, except this house is roughly the size of a small mountain, and it has absolutely no interest in letting you borrow a cup of sugar. The night air stays dry and gentle. The sand shifts underfoot with that soft hush, and the pyramid blocks the wind in a way that makes you feel tucked in, sheltered by geometry. Most historians agree the builders relied on tools that sound simple by modern standards, and archaeology suggests a mix of copper tools for softer stone, harder stone pounders for heavy work, wooden levers, ropes, and patient repetition. The evidence we do have points to a working world where skill matters as much as muscle. When you look at the blocks, you can almost feel the rhythm of the job. Strike, chip, measure, adjust. Again, again, again. You crouch a little, not because you need to, but because your body likes the idea of getting closer to detail. You imagine the tool marks, the faint scratches that might have once been sharper. You picture copper chisels biting into limestone, then slowly dulling, then being hammered back into shape, then dulled again. Copper is not steel. Copper is the friend who shows up to help you move, but needs a snack break every 12 minutes. Light joke number 1. You picture an ancient worker holding a copper chisel and thinking, this is fine. Everything is fine, while the chisel looks back, like I am doing my best. Please stop asking me to be iron. Archaeology suggests dolerite pounders were used to shape granite and tougher stone. And most historians agree this kind of tool use is consistent with what we know from quarries and workshops. Granite is stubborn. It does not politely step aside for a soft metal blade, so the approach becomes one of impact and abrasion. You pound, you grind, you saw with sand, as an abrasive. You drill using repeated motion and grit that does the cutting. It is less like slicing a cake and more like slowly persuading the stone to cooperate. One interpretation is that the most impressive part is not any single tool, but the system. You do not rely on one magical method. You combine methods. You use the right material for the right job. You build a workflow. Even in your own life, you know this feeling. You do not clean a whole house with one paper towel. You switch tools, switch tactics, and sometimes you just stare at the mess and hope it organises itself out of fear. Ancient builders, unfortunately, do not get that last option. You walk a little farther and imagine the quarry activity, the shaping yards, the piles of chips, the dust on skin. You picture saws made of copper that do not cut by sharpness alone, but by dragging abrasive sand back and forth until the stone yields. The evidence we do have points to this kind of abrasive cutting in ancient stonework. It is slow, but it works. Light joke number 2. You realise the pyramids might be the ultimate proof that sand is not only for beaches and awkward vacation photos. Sand is also a tool, a weapon, and a mild inconvenience that gets into your shoes and never leaves. The builders had sand everywhere, and they looked at it and said, "Great, we can use this." Most historians agree moving blocks required clever handling rather than raw strength alone. And archaeology suggests sledges, ramps, levers, and lubrication could reduce friction. You picture a heavy block on a wooden sledge. You picture a team pulling ropes in a steady rhythm. You picture someone pouring water onto sand to make it pack and slide more smoothly, turning the ground into a controlled surface, instead of loose grains that fight every motion. One interpretation is that this is where human ingenuity feels most relatable. You do not need impossible power. You need to know how to make friction your friend. You need to understand weight and slope and timing. A careful reading might suggest that the true technology is knowledge of materials and teamwork, plus the willingness to do the same motion 10,000 times without the rope into the Nile out of pure exhaustion. Now the mist comes in but gently. Some people look at the scale and precision and feel that the tools must have been better than we think. They imagine hidden devices, unknown alloys, or advanced techniques. A fringe idea proposes that the stones were moved using lost methods, like sound vibration or other dramatic forces, almost like the plateau was once a stage for secret physics. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. Still it survives, because it feels poetic. It turns labour into a spell. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream explanation can feel boring to a modern mind that expects shortcuts. But boring does not mean wrong. Boring can be accurate. The evidence we do have points to practical methods. If we treat the dramatic claims as possibility rather than conclusion, we can still enjoy the wonder without pretending it has been solved. You stand again and let your eyes travel along the courses of stone. You can almost see where blocks meet, where lines drift slightly, where adjustments were made. This is not a machine made from perfect parts. This is a human build. That fact anchors you. It also makes room for a quieter kind of mystery. Historians still argue whether the builders followed a single consistent construction method from start to finish, or adapted tools and techniques as the project rose and problems changed. That debate is important because it keeps the story flexible in the right way. It allows evolution. It allows learning. It allows the idea that the methods on day 1 might not be the methods on year 10. It allows the possibility that earlier experiments, earlier attempts, earlier training grounds shaped what becomes possible at Giza. One interpretation is that the Old Kingdom did not invent everything from nothing. Skills have roots. Quarrying has roots. Stonework has roots. It's possible that earlier communities, even before the full dynastic state, worked stone in smaller ways that do not show up as giant monuments. Maybe they cut blocks for simple structures. Maybe they shaped stone for shrines. Maybe they learned how to align and level and measure long before someone decided to stack limestone into a perfect mountain. You take a slow walk along a patch of bedrock that feels smoother underfoot. It makes you think about levelling, about how you would prepare a foundation for something this heavy. Archaeology suggests builders used levelling techniques that could involve water channels and careful measurement. Most historians agree the base of the Great Pyramid is remarkably level, which is a practical achievement that does not require magic, but does require attention. Light joke number 3. You imagine an ancient supervisor standing over the foundation with the intensity of someone hanging a picture frame at home. A tiny tilt, a deep sigh. Adjust it. Know the other way. Now it is worse. Now it is better. The difference is that here the picture frame is the Great Pyramid, and if it is crooked, it stays crooked for a few thousand years. Now the cinematic what if arrives soft as the wind that barely touches your face. What if there were older workshops nearby, not a lost empire, but a lost chapter of practice? What if a small community of stoneworkers, long before pharaohs turned stone into state power, learned how to quarry efficiently, how to shape blocks cleanly, how to manage teams? What if those skills were inherited and amplified the way a quiet family recipe becomes a restaurant once someone finally has the money for a bigger kitchen? To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have points strongly to Old Kingdom activity at Giza. Still, the plateau is part of a longer landscape. People lived along the Nile long before the 4th dynasty. They built, they traded, they experimented. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You keep your feet on the solid ground. The pyramids are human, the tools are real, the methods are plausible. And yet you allow yourself one more calm question, one that does not demand a dramatic answer. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not at a vanished high-tech civilization, but at the deep continuity of human learning. The way knowledge can pass hand to hand, generation to generation, until one moment arrives where it can finally be used at full scale. You breathe in slow and steady. The warm stone beside you holds the day's memory. The night sky above holds its own quiet math. And you keep walking, letting the sand hush, and the idea of patient tools lull your mind into a gentle, credible wonder. You wander toward the low rise where the ground feels more carved than natural, and the night air changes in a subtle way, like the desert is shifting from wide open silence to something more personal. The pyramids remain behind you, steady and geometric, but ahead the plateau begins to feel sculpted, shaped, worked over like a place that has been edited many times by many hands. Most historians agree the Great Sphinx is part of the Giza complex and is commonly linked to the Old Kingdom, often associated with King Khafra's era, and archaeology suggests the surrounding temples, causeways and construction context fit that general time frame. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where royal monuments, ritual spaces and stonework belong to the same broad period of intense building. You see the Sphinx's silhouette first low and long like a lion, trying to pretend it is only a hill. When you move closer, the face appears solemn and worn, as if time has been sanding it down with patient hands. There is something oddly calming about it. Not scary, not dramatic, just steady like a guard that has been on duty so long it has forgotten what it was guarding. You stop and let your eyes travel across the body. The stone looks layered with bands and textures that catch the moonlight differently. You can see places where the surface seems rougher, places where repairs have happened, and places where the rock has weathered into gentle curves. One interpretation is that weathering is the quiet doorway where questions enter. Stone does not come with a timestamp. It comes with patterns. People look at those patterns and ask what kind of forces shape them and for how long. The idea of a straightforward Old Kingdom origin can feel complicated when you are staring at a monument that looks like it has been through more than one kind of weather. And then in the softest voice, the cinematic what if arrives. What if the Sphinx has watched more seasons than we can easily place? Not because it came from a lost super civilization, but because the plateau itself has a longer story of exposure, burial, and re-exposure that makes time feel slippery. Archaeology suggests the Sphinx was carved from the bedrock of the plateau, which means it is not a statue placed here, it is a piece of the landscape turned into a form. That is an important mainstream anchor. If you carve a monument out of bedrock, you are also carving the plateau's geology into your story. The rock layers become part of the body. The weathering becomes part of the evidence. Historians still argue whether the patterns of erosion on the Sphinx and its enclosure are best explained by wind and sand over long periods, by water-related processes in certain conditions, by salts and moisture, by later repairs, or by a combination that makes simple answers feel too neat. You breathe slowly after thinking that sentence, because even your sleepy brain deserves mercy. The short version is that people debate what the surface tells us. Some researchers emphasize wind erosion and sand abrasion as the main sculptors over time. Others focus on the possibility that water-related weathering could have played a role, perhaps through rainfall, in different climatic phases, or moisture moving through stone and carrying salts that weaken the surface. Many careful scholars point out that the Sphinx has been buried in sand for long stretches, then uncovered, then repaired, then exposed again, which can complicate the patterns. The evidence is real. The interpretation of the evidence is where the debate lives. Light joke number 1, you realise the Sphinx has basically been in the world's longest argument about skincare, wind, water, salt, sand repairs, and everyone has an opinion, and the Sphinx just sits there like, please stop diagnosing my pores and let me nap. Most historians agree Egypt's climate has not been identical across all millennia, and archaeology suggests environmental changes affect monuments over time. That is solid ground. Climatic shifts changing water tables, occasional rainfall patterns, and the way sand moves can all influence stone surfaces. The question is not whether weathering happens. The question is what the weathering patterns mean for dating and for understanding the monument's history. One interpretation is that the Sphinx might have a more complex timeline of exposure than a simple, continuous, open-air life. It is possible that long periods of sand burial protected some surfaces while others remained exposed. It is possible that later dynasties, seeing an ancient monument already worn, restored and reshaped parts, which would blend older and newer surfaces into one tired face. This is the kind of complexity that does not require a lost civilization, just a long human habit of returning to old monuments and trying to keep them standing. Now the misty edge comes in carefully. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx is much older than the Old Kingdom, perhaps carved in a far earlier era and later adopted into the dynastic landscape. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a dramatically older Sphinx is not conclusive. Still, the idea persists because the monument feels ancient in a way that makes people hungry for a deeper origin story. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Feeling ancient is not the same as being earlier than the mainstream timeline. The Sphinx can be Old Kingdom and still carry signs of a long, complicated life. The plateau can be a 4th dynasty masterpiece and still sit on older ground that has seen earlier human activity. Those are different questions, and tonight you keep them separated the way you keep socks separated from sand, which is honestly a daily life pro tip in the desert. Light joke number 2. You imagine ancient restorers showing up with the confidence of someone who watched one tutorial and now thinks they are an expert. They look at the Sphinx and say, I can fix that. And the Sphinx quietly replies, you are welcome to try, but I will still be here when your tools turn to dust. You step closer and notice how the Sphinx's face seems both expressive and worn down like a coin that has passed through too many hands. The monument feels less like a single moment in time and more like a conversation across centuries. Most historians agree the Sphinx was a powerful symbol in later periods too, and archaeology suggests it attracted attention, reverence, and restoration in different eras. The evidence we do have points to continuing cultural engagement. A monument that lasts becomes a magnet. People build stories around it. They protect it. They argue about it. They imagine what it means. One interpretation is that this long afterlife is part of why the lost civilization idea sticks. When a monument is old enough to be restored by people who are themselves ancient to us, it creates a layered feeling. You can stand here and sense multiple timelines at once, and your mind starts asking, what did it mean to the people who found it already old? Then the cinematic what if arrives again, softer and sleepier. What if the Sphinx was already half buried at some point, its face peeking out of sand, like a memory, and a later king looked at it and felt the same awe you feel now, deciding to claim it as part of a royal story, not by deception, but by inheritance. Now you let yourself glance at the world of rumours just briefly, like you are peeking into a gift shop without buying anything. A popular rumour claims there are hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx, sometimes framed as a secret archive of forgotten knowledge. Another popular rumour calls this imagined archive the Hall of Records. These are not mainstream conclusions. They are part of the mythology that gathers around famous monuments. The evidence for such dramatic hidden libraries is thin, and when people talk about it with certainty, it is worth lowering the volume. To be clear, this is debated. Underground spaces and voids can exist in many ancient sites for many reasons, including natural cavities, later tunnelling and structural features. But turning that possibility into a confident story about a lost civilization is a leap. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it stays in the realm of bedtime curiosity where it belongs. Light joke number 3. If there is a secret chamber under the Sphinx, you just know it contains at least one lost set of keys and a very old note that says, "Do not touch this," and someone touched it anyway. You stand still for a moment and let the night settle. The Sphinx looks out across the plateau with a calm that feels contagious. The pyramids behind you hold the sky like anchored shadows. The sand continues its quiet motion, patient and persistent. The evidence we do have points to Old Kingdom construction at Giza. The interpretation question is about how the stone's surface records time exposure, burial repair and climate. And the imagined what if is a soft glow around the edges, not a hard claim. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You take a slow breath and you let the Sphinx's worn face remind you of a simple truth that is both ordinary and profound. Stone lasts, but it changes. Stories last, but they change too. Tonight you do not need to solve the Sphinx. You only need to let it be what it is, a monument that invites you to wonder carefully without rushing past the evidence into the fog. You walk away from the Sphinx with the feeling that you have just listened to an old person clear their throat before telling a story. The kind of story that does not start with fireworks. It starts with patience. The plateau behind you holds its monuments like steady furniture. Ahead of you, the land begins to hint at movement and connection, not just static stone. You follow the idea of paths now, of lines that lead somewhere, of how a pyramid is never only a pyramid, it is a destination with a route. Most historians agree the Giza pyramids were part of broader complexes that included valley temples, mortuary temples, causeways, and associated infrastructure, and archaeology suggests these elements worked together as a ceremonial and logistical system. The evidence we do have points to a carefully designed landscape that connected the river edge to the plateau, moving people, materials, and meaning along the same corridors. You picture the Nile in the Old Kingdom not exactly like it is today, but still a life artery. Boats glide along it, low and heavy with cargo. The air near water smells different, cooler, greener. You imagine limestone blocks on barges, wood creaking, ropes tightening, and men calling in steady voices. In your mind, the river becomes a slow conveyor belt that makes the impossible feel routine. One interpretation is that the best clue to how the pyramids were built is not any single stone, but the entire network that supported them. A causeway is not glamorous, but it is honest. A port is not mysterious, but it is powerful. If you can move heavy loads along water, you solve half your problems. If you can coordinate deliveries, you turn time into a tool. And now gently the cinematic what if arrives. What if some of the routes used for the Great Pyramid Age were not invented from scratch, but reused or improved from earlier pathways along the desert edge? What if the plateau's infrastructure is partly a renovation, a reworking of older human movement that once connected small settlements, quarries, and sacred points before kings turned the whole area into a royal stage? Archaeology suggests there were working areas, ramps, and transport systems tied to pyramid construction, and most historians agree the Old Kingdom state could mobilize resources at scale. That is the mainstream anchor. If you're looking for a practical explanation, infrastructure is where you find it. You slow your pace as you imagine the causeway that once linked the Valley Temple area near the floodplain up to the mortuary temple by the pyramid. In daylight, it would have been a strong line cutting through the terrain. In ceremony, it would have been a processional path. In logistics, it would have been a road for moving tools, provisions, and stone. Light joke number 1, you realise the causeway is basically an ancient multi-purpose hallway. It is a sacred corridor and a delivery route, which means that somewhere in the Old Kingdom someone was trying to haul a crate of supplies while a solemn procession was happening and everybody pretended not to make eye contact. Most historians agree the pyramids were not built in isolation, and archaeology suggests construction involved staging areas, workshops, and support buildings. The evidence we do have points to a busy landscape that would have felt more like a giant organised camp than a lonely monument. In your mind, the plateau becomes alive with motion. You can almost smell bread baking in large ovens. You can almost hear the scrape of wood on stone. You can almost hear supervisors calling out instructions. One interpretation is that when we look at the plateau, now quiet and empty at night, we can underestimate how engineered it once was. Engineering leaves traces, but it also gets erased. Temporary structures come down, wood decays, camps are dismantled, even roads can fade under sand. So it is possible that earlier infrastructure existed in simpler forms, then was replaced by grander versions during the 4th dynasty. Historians still argue whether certain features of the Giza landscape reflect one unified plan, executed cleanly, or a series of evolving plans that reuse terrain and routes in ways we do not fully reconstruct. Again, that sentence creates honest room. If the plan evolved, reuse becomes likely. If reuse happened, then older traces might be incorporated without fanfare. That does not mean a lost civilization. It could mean practical builders recycling good ideas the way you reuse a sturdy box because it is too good to throw away. Now you let the misty idea enter without making demands. A fringe idea proposes that Giza's infrastructure hints at a much older, more advanced system, perhaps remains of an earlier civilization's roadways and ports. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a fully separate, older, engineered network is thin. Still, the idea has emotional appeal because it makes the plateau feel like it sits on top of a buried city plan. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Infrastructure can look advanced without being anachronistic. Good road building is good road building. Effective transport is effective transport. The Old Kingdom could build complex systems because it had reason to and resources to. The question you hold tonight is more modest. Could there have been earlier uses of the same corridors, earlier movement patterns that later became formalised into royal causeways and roads? You imagine a pre-dynastic landscape for a moment. The Nile edge is dotted with small communities. People walk along the desert margin where the ground is firm. They carry goods. They visit sacred spots. They quarry small amounts of stone. They leave behind paths worn by repetition. Then centuries pass and a powerful state arrives with grand plans. It sees the same firm ground, the same useful routes, and it builds on them literally and figuratively. Light joke number 2, you picture ancient planners discovering an old path and saying, wow, someone already did the hard work of finding the best route, and then immediately claiming they invented it. Humans do that, even now, especially now. Most historians agree the Fourth Dynasty projects required enormous coordination, and archaeology suggests evidence of provisioning and organisation supports the idea of a managed workforce. The evidence we do have points to a society that could plan not only the monument but the supply chain. Stone food tools, wood rope. Everything has to arrive at the right time. If it does not, the whole project stalls, and stalled projects are the ancient equivalent of staring at a loading bar stuck at 99%, which is the kind of suffering no era deserves. One interpretation is that the sophistication of the supply chain hints at deep administrative experience. It's possible that earlier state building, earlier temple projects, earlier quarry operations trained the systems that later made Giza possible. Again, not a lost civilization, but a long apprenticeship. Now the cinematic what if returns calmer and more intimate. What if the plateau's greatest secret is not hidden under stone, but hidden in the roots? What if the true evidence of earlier life is not a dramatic artifact, but the subtle alignment of roads, the reused foundation of a path, the way human feet prefer the same stable ground over and over? You pause and listen again. The night is quiet. If you imagine hard enough, you can always hear water lapping at a river bank that is no longer right here. You can almost hear the soft thud of a heavy block settling on a sledge. You can almost hear a distant call, steady, rhythmic, like a work song, designed to keep everyone pulling together. Light joke number 3, you imagine the ancient version of a motivational speech. Someone stands up, clears their throat, and says, "All right, team. Remember, we are not just moving rocks. We are moving destiny." And everyone else is like, "Yes, yes, destiny. Can we also move lunch?" You keep walking, following the invisible line of the causeway, in your mind, letting it pull you toward the next question. The pyramids remain behind you as anchors. The Sphinx remains as a quiet face in the dark. The infrastructure imagined and partly known becomes the connective tissue that makes everything feel human again. What's broadly accepted is that the Old Kingdom built a complex system to make Giza work. One interpretation is that parts of that system might rest on older patterns of movement and use. And the gentle what if is that the plateau's story could be layered not in a dramatic hidden truth way, but in the ordinary way landscapes are layered when humans return again and again to the same good ground. You keep drifting along the imagined line where workers once moved between living space and building space, between the ordinary needs of the day and the extraordinary demands of stone. The night feels steady now, like it has settled into its own rhythm. The plateau is quiet, but your mind keeps filling it with gentle motion, and the sand hush under your shoes remains your little soundtrack. Most historians agree there were worker communities and support settlements near Giza, and archaeology suggests evidence of housing bakeries, storage areas, and administration tied to the pyramid building era. The evidence we do have points to something deeply unromantic in the best way people lived here, ate here, worked here, slept here, and then woke up and did it again. No mystery needed for that. Just humans being humans with big responsibilities and probably very sore backs. You slow down and imagine the worker town not as ruins, but as a living place. Low mud brick walls, narrow lanes, smoke from cooking, the smell of bread and ash, people calling to each other, someone laughing, someone arguing, someone trying to fix a broken sandal like their life depends on it, because walking barefoot on hot stone is not a heroic aesthetic, it is just pain. One interpretation is that these settlements are a strong anchor against the lost civilization fantasy. A lost civilization story often wants the builders to be shadowy, unknown, separate from ordinary life. But worker villages pull the story back into the human world. They suggest the pyramids were built by real people who needed food and rest and organisation. And yet even here the mist can still enter in a careful way. The cinematic what if does not have to erase the worker town. It can change the question, what if the organisation visible in these settlements is the result of long practice? What if earlier communities along the Nile learned how to coordinate labour and provisioning long before Giza and the Fourth Dynasty simply scaled it up? Archaeology suggests large bakeries and food production systems could support a massive workforce, and most historians agree rations like bread and beer were central to daily life. The evidence we do have points to a kind of industrial routine, not factories with machines, but large-scale production with human hands, fire and planning. Light joke. Number one, you imagine someone working in the bakery and thinking, I did not sign up to help build eternity. I signed up to make bread, and now apparently my bread is part of eternity. Your resume is going to be wild. You picture storage jars lined up like a quiet army. You picture someone counting out grain. You picture an administrator making notes, tracking who worked where, who received what. Even if you do not see the papyrus in your imagination, you sense the bureaucracy. The pyramids are stone, but the project runs on lists. Most historians agree ancient Egypt had a strong administrative tradition, and archaeology suggests record keeping and organised provisioning were important for state projects. That is a mainstream anchor. It fits the story. It makes the pyramids feel like the result of social systems, not supernatural intervention. One interpretation is that administration leaves uneven traces. Stone lasts. Paper does not. Wood does not. So the surviving evidence might show you only the strongest, most durable parts of the system. It's possible that the deeper routines, the earlier versions of those routines, left fewer footprints. That is where people sometimes insert a lost civilization. But you do not need to jump that far. It is enough to say that earlier phases of organisation could exist without leaving obvious proof at Giza itself. Historians still argue whether the worker communities represent a stable, long-term settlement model or a more flexible, rotating labour system that changed as the project's needs changed. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine the human experience. A stable town suggests families' longer routines and social structures that extend beyond the building site. A rotating labour system suggests waves of workers coming and going, bringing skills from different regions, creating a moving network of knowledge. Either way, you get a picture of Egypt as a connected society capable of mobilising. Now the misty rumour enters, but politely. A popular rumour claims the pyramids could not have been built by humans because the labour requirements would have been impossible. This rumour is common and it is emotionally powerful, but it often underestimates what organised societies can do over time. The evidence we do have points to human workforces, human provisioning, and human planning. The project is huge, yes, but huge does not mean impossible. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When someone says humans could not do this, what they often mean is, I cannot imagine humans doing this quickly, casually, or alone. But if you give a society decades leadership resources and coordination, the scale becomes more plausible. The mainstream story is not a miracle. It is a long, grinding commitment. Light joke number 2, you realise the pyramids are basically the ultimate proof that if humans will build an entire cathedral of effort for a king, they will also absolutely spend 4 hours assembling furniture just because the instructions said do not tighten screws until step 12. We obey weird goals. We commit. You walk through your imagined worker lanes and feel the night air shift again. The desert is dry, but in your mind there is moisture in the smell of dough, in the steam of cooking pots, in the sweat on skin. You imagine the daily fatigue, the quiet pride, the complaints, the jokes, the small rituals that make hard work bearable. Most historians agree workers likely had specialised roles, and archaeology suggests evidence of craft activity and organised labour supports the idea of teams. That is mainstream. It also makes the pyramid feel less mysterious. A team that repeats a task becomes skilled. A skilled team produces consistent results. One interpretation is that skill itself can look like magic to outsiders. If you do not know how someone does something, it can feel impossible. Stone cutting, hauling, levelling, measuring. When done by practiced hands, these become efficient. The lost civilization theory sometimes grows in the gap between outsider amazement and insider routine. Now the cinematic what if returns soft and gentle. What if the real lost thing is not a civilization but the everyday memory of how people work together? What if we have lost the human feel of it? The smell of the bakery at dawn, the clatter of pots, the rhythm of feet on packed earth, the sound of ropes sliding through hands. You pause and let that thought settle because it is calming. The pyramids are often turned into arguments. Tonight you are turning them back into life. Light joke number 3. You imagine an ancient worker lying down at night and thinking, tomorrow I will move stone again, and then immediately falling asleep like a champion, because nothing cures insomnia like having to haul limestone at sunrise. You keep walking and you let the idea of the worker town become another anchor. The evidence we do have points to human systems supporting the build. The interpretation angle is that these systems could have deeper roots in earlier periods, and the what if is not that a hidden super civilization did it all, but that the plateau might sit at the meeting point of long developing human organization where older habits became state power on a grand scale. You breathe slowly, the desert night remains gentle, the pyramids still stand quiet and indifferent, while your mind drifts through the warm, ordinary human world that made the extraordinary possible. You follow the slope of the plateau with your eyes, and your imagination does something it always does in places like this. It tries to rebuild the missing parts, not the missing stones, the missing movement, because a pyramid sitting still is impressive, but a pyramid being built is almost impossible to picture, unless your mind creates a whole temporary world of ramps, ropes, timber shouts, and constant minor problems. Most historians agree some form of ramp system was used to raise blocks as construction climbed, and archaeology suggests practical hauling methods with sledges, levers, and graded pathways fit what we know about ancient engineering. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth that is both satisfying and frustrating. If you want to lift heavy things repeatedly, you build a slope and you pull. You walk along the base and look up, letting your neck tilt until you feel that small strain that reminds you you are not built for staring at mountains all night. You imagine a ramp rising from the ground wide enough for teams steady enough to bear weight angled gently enough that humans can pull without turning into exhausted noodles. One interpretation is that there probably was not just one ramp idea, because one ramp idea has to solve too many problems at once. Early on, a straight ramp might make sense when the pyramid is low. Later, the ramp would need to grow longer and longer to keep the slope manageable, and that means a massive volume of ramp material. You can almost feel the practical question forming like a yawn. At what point does the ramp become its own pyramid? And then the cinematic what if arrives with a quiet grin. What if the missing blueprint is not missing because it was hidden, but because it was never a single blueprint at all? What if the builders treated ramps like scaffolding, changing them as needed, adapting to each stage, leaving behind no neat diagram for modern people who love neat diagrams? You picture different possibilities as you walk. A straight ramp that runs from the desert up to one face. A zigzag ramp that climbs the side in angled segments, a spiral ramp that wraps around as the pyramid rises. Each one has strengths and headaches. Each one feels plausible in certain phases. Light joke number 1. You realise this is the ancient version of assembling furniture without instructions. Everyone has a theory, everyone swears their method is best. And meanwhile the pyramid just sits there like, I am the final product. Please stop arguing and bring more rope. Archaeology suggests remnants of ramps have been found at various pyramid sites, and most historians agree ramps were common solutions in ancient building. That is mainstream and comforting. Humans do not reinvent gravity for every project. They use slopes, levers and teamwork. The challenge at Giza is that temporary ramps are meant to be removed, reused or simply eroded away. They are not designed to survive as monuments. One interpretation is that this removal is exactly why the debate stays lively. You can see the pyramid, but you cannot see the ramps. You can measure the final geometry, but you cannot easily map the temporary logistics that made it possible. So scholars reconstruct plausible systems from physics, traces and comparisons. Those reconstructions can vary, and variation can invite more imaginative stories. Historians still argue whether the primary ramp system at the Great Pyramid was a straight external ramp, a set of zigzag ramps, a spiralling route, or a combination that changed as construction rose. You pause and let that sentence settle because it is the honest heart of this section. There is strong agreement that ramps of some kind were involved. There is debate about the exact shape and strategy. That debate is normal. It does not mean the story is unknowable. It means we have a giant result and only partial traces of the process. You walk a little farther and imagine the ramp material itself. Mud brick, rubble, limestone chips, packed sand, timber supports. You imagine crews dedicated not to the pyramid, but to the ramp, constantly maintaining it, flattening ruts, adding fill, adjusting the surface so sledges do not dig in. The ramp is a living tool. It needs care. Most historians agree large projects required specialised labour, and archaeology suggests teams likely focused on specific tasks like quarrying, hauling stone dressing, and logistics. The evidence we do have points to a work culture where someone always has a job, even if that job is simply making sure the pathway stays usable. Light joke number 2, somewhere out here in the old world, someone's entire professional identity is ramp maintenance, and they are absolutely tired of nobody appreciating ramps. They want a ramp pyramid, just once, for them. Now your mind drifts toward one of the more talked about ideas in modern discussions. The internal ramp concept, the suggestion that a ramp might have been built inside the pyramid's outer structure, like a hidden roadway running within the mass. Some people like this idea because it explains how you could keep the exterior neat and still move blocks upward. Some people dislike it because direct evidence is hard to pin down in a way that satisfies everyone. A careful reading might suggest that internal movement paths are possible in principle, but the evidence for a specific internal ramp design at Giza is not conclusive enough to be treated as settled fact. To be clear, this is debated. It remains one interpretation among several. It can be treated as an intriguing possibility rather than a conclusion. And then softly, the cinematic what if arrives. What if the pyramid is like a memory palace of construction, holding within it not secret wisdom from a lost civilization, but the practical traces of how humans solved an enormous problem with evolving tactics? A fringe idea proposes that the ramps were unnecessary because the builders used some lost technique like levitation sound, or a vanished science that made stone float. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. It thrives mostly because it is dramatic and because it turns labour into magic. But the mainstream evidence points to hauling, ramps and planning. The simplest explanation is often the most durable, even if it is not as flashy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is easy to underestimate what coordinated people can do with time. A big job done slowly can look like a miracle if you only see the final result. But if you imagine each day bringing a small gain a few courses higher, a few stones set, the miracle becomes a schedule. You keep walking and imagine the rhythm of hauling. The rope fibres bite into palms. Feet press into packed sand. Someone calls the cadence. Someone else answers. The sledge slides forward a few inches, then a foot, then another. The block arrives at a staging point. Workers reposition levers. Stone dressers adjust faces. Surveyors check alignment. Everything repeats. Most historians agree precision in large structures often comes from repeated checking. And archaeology suggests builders used levelling and alignment methods throughout construction, not just at the start. The evidence we do have points to a process of constant measurement, which is how you prevent small errors from becoming giant disasters. Light joke number 3. You can picture an ancient worker whispering, "Please let this be the last time I move this block." And then someone says, "Great news. We need you to move it again, but slightly to the left." That worker invents the first silent scream. One interpretation is that ramp strategies might have been mixed. A straight ramp, early a wrapping route, later smaller ramps to lift stones onto courses, internal pathways for certain materials, external routes for others. It's possible the builders were pragmatic, using whatever worked at each stage, rather than pledging loyalty to one elegant design. Now the cinematic what if returns gentle and sleepy. What if the reason we cannot point to one ramp is because the pyramid itself is the record of many solutions layered like sediment? Each stage leaves traces in the final geometry, but the temporary tools vanish like footprints in windblown sand. You slow your breathing, the night air is steady, the stone mass beside you holds warmth, the sky above remains indifferent and calm. The ramp debate, when treated carefully, does not destabilize the mainstream story. It enriches it. It reminds you that ancient building is not a single trick. It is 1,000 small choices, a moving set of problems, and a willingness to adjust. The evidence we do have points to human methods, ramp-based hauling, and evolving strategies. One interpretation is that the missing blueprint reflects adaptation rather than secrecy, and the soft what if is not that a lost civilization built everything, but that the builder's process may be more flexible and inventive than any single diagram can capture. You keep walking, letting the idea of temporary ramps fade into the night as if the desert itself is gently erasing them, again, grain by grain, leaving only the finished mountain of stone to whisper quietly that patience can become architecture. You keep moving until the air feels slightly different again, as if the plateau has shifted from the outer world of hauling and ramps into the inner world of hidden spaces. The Great Pyramid is still a mountain, but now it is also a body with an interior, a set of corridors and chambers, tucked inside a mass that seems from the outside like it should be solid all the way through. Most historians agree the Great Pyramid contains internal passages and chambers associated with royal burial and ritual, and archaeology suggests the layout reflects both practical engineering choices and symbolic religious ideas. The evidence we do have points to a structure that is not just stacked stone, but planned space, carefully positioned voids within a monumental shell. You slow down as if you are about to enter a quiet room. In your imagination, you step toward an entrance that feels small compared to the pyramid's bulk, like a keyhole in a castle wall. The stone around it looks worn, as if countless hands and eyes have passed by, searching, pointing, wondering. You think about how humans are drawn to interiors. We can accept a mountain as a mountain, but if someone says there is a room inside the mountain, we instantly want to see it. Light joke number 1. It is the ancient version of hearing. Someone say there is a closet under the stairs, and immediately deciding that closet is now the most interesting thing in the house. Archaeology suggests the Great Pyramid's internal spaces include descending passages, ascending routes, and major chambers, and most historians agree these features were engineered with impressive precision. The evidence we do have points to practical concerns too. Weight distribution matters. Structural stability matters. If you carve big spaces, you must manage the load above them. So the interior is both spiritual and structural. One interpretation is that the interior layout can be read in multiple ways. On the mainstream side, chambers and passages serve burial protection and ritual symbolism. On the interpretive side, certain features might also reflect construction logistics, like how to access or place blocks, how to build internal relieving spaces, how to adjust the pyramid's stability as it rose. A careful reading might suggest that the pyramid's interior is not a single-purpose design. It could be layered with practical and symbolic intentions. And now, gently, the cinematic what-if arrives. What if some of the interior features are inherited ideas, older symbolic patterns that predate the 4th dynasty carried forward and reinterpreted in stone? Not a lost civilization blueprint, but a cultural memory, a set of sacred shapes and directions that got folded into the design. You imagine walking through a passage where the air cools and the sound of your footsteps becomes softer, swallowed by stone. You run your hand along the wall and feel a surface that is smoother than the exterior, blocks carved and adjusted. You sense the slope under your feet, the way it guides you downward or upward, and you feel how the pyramid controls your body, gently dictating pace and posture. Most historians agree the internal arrangement has symbolic associations tied to ancient Egyptian beliefs about kingship and the afterlife, and archaeology suggests the pyramid form itself related to ideas of ascent and cosmic order. The evidence we do have points to religion not as a separate decoration, but as a framework that shaped architecture. The pyramid is a ritual machine as much as a tomb. Historians still argue whether particular shafts and internal features were primarily functional, primarily symbolic, or designed to serve both roles in ways that are hard to untangle. That phrase feels like a quiet lantern, functional or symbolic, or both. It is a good reminder that ancient people did not always divide the world the way modern people do. A passage can be a structural necessity and a spiritual metaphor at the same time. A shaft can relieve pressure and point toward a star. A chamber can hold a body and hold an idea. Light joke number 2. You think about how humans today will put a decorative fake beam in a living room because it looks cozy, and then also hang a plant from it because it is useful, functional and symbolic same beam. Ancient Egypt just did it with millions of stone blocks. Now you let your mind glance at one of the more commonly discussed features, the narrow shafts that extend from some chambers. People have proposed different explanations for them, including ventilation for workers' symbolic pathways for the spirit, or alignment towards specific celestial points. The mainstream view often emphasizes symbolic or ritual significance, while also acknowledging practical possibilities during construction. One interpretation is that these shafts reflect a culture deeply engaged with the sky, a society that used celestial cycles as a model for order. If you want to connect a king's destiny to the heavens, you do it with architecture that reaches points and aligns. This interpretation fits comfortably with the precision you have already considered. And now the cinematic what if arrives soft and dreamy. What if the shafts were not only about one king's journey, but about a long tradition of sky-oriented thinking that reaches back into earlier eras when pre-dynastic communities watched the same stars and told stories that later became royal theology? A popular rumour claims the internal chambers and passages hide a secret library of lost knowledge, sometimes described as a storehouse of ancient science. This rumour is not supported by strong evidence in the way it is often presented, but it persists because humans love the idea that stone can hide answers. The pyramid becomes a vault in the imagination, holding the missing chapter of human history in a sealed room. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The presence of hidden spaces does not automatically imply hidden revelations. Many internal voids can exist for structural reasons. Some spaces can be lost to time unknown simply because the pyramid is huge and our access is limited. Unknown does not equal supernatural. Unknown is just unknown. Light joke number 3. If you ever want to understand human curiosity, just remember that if someone says there is a sealed room and you cannot enter, your brain instantly decides it contains either treasure secrets or, at minimum, a very dramatic note that says, "Please stop entering sealed rooms." Most historians agree the pyramid's interior reflects deliberate planning, and archaeology suggests the builders understood how to manage load and stress with features like relieving spaces. The evidence we do have points to engineering that is careful rather than accidental. When you imagine the weight above those chambers, you understand why engineers would think about pressure. Stone is strong, but it is not polite. It will crush whatever you place beneath it if you do not guide it properly. One interpretation is that engineering knowledge, like surveying knowledge, can have deep roots. If a society builds in stone, repeatedly it learns what holds and what fails. It's possible that earlier building traditions, even simpler ones, helped establish the confidence to carve voids inside a mountain of blocks. The Old Kingdom could have inherited and refined earlier stone traditions, turning them into monumental architecture. Now the cinematic what if continues in a credible way. What if the pyramid's interior is like a cultural archive, not in the sense of a hidden library, but in the sense that it preserves design habits and symbolic thinking that stretch back beyond the king's lifetime? A passage is not only a corridor, it is a tradition made physical. You imagine standing in a chamber where the air is still and cool. You hear your own breathing. You feel the stone around you like a thick quiet. In such a space, even a small sound becomes a companion. The pyramid is so big that it can make silence feel heavy, and that heaviness can make people imagine deeper meanings. To be clear, this is debated. The mainstream evidence supports an Old Kingdom context for the pyramid's core design and purpose. The interpretive space lies in how we read specific features, how we explain shafts, how we imagine construction steps, and how we understand the layering of function and symbolism. You step back out into the night in your mind, letting the cool interior fade behind you. The pyramid's outer face returns huge and simple again. You realize something calming. Whether you focus on the exterior or the interior, the pattern is the same. Solid ground, then interpretation, then gentle imagination. The evidence we do have points to a human-built structure designed for kingship and ritual. One interpretation is that some features blend practical engineering with symbolic sky thinking, and the soft what if is that this blend might reflect traditions older than any one pharaoh carried forward and magnified until they became a stone mountain with rooms inside. You keep walking, letting the idea of chambers and shafts settle into your mind like cool air, and the sand hush under your shoes continues steady and quiet as the night carries you onward. You walk on with the calm feeling of someone leaving a quiet room and stepping back into open air, except the open air is still wrapped in ancient stone and starlight. The pyramids are behind you again, their silhouettes steady, and the sky above them looks like a dark ocean sprinkled with pale salt. Most historians agree ancient Egyptian religion connected kingship with the heavens, and archaeology suggests funerary architecture often reflected cosmic ideas about order, rebirth, and the afterlife. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the sky is not only scenery but a map of meaning. When you look at the pyramids and then look at the stars, you understand why people feel the urge to connect them. You let your eyes settle on a cluster of brighter stars. You do not need to name them tonight. Naming makes the mind wake up. Instead, you simply notice how the sky feels structured, like it has patterns just beyond your grasp. In the Old Kingdom, those patterns mattered. The rising and setting of stars helped mark time. The cycling of seasons shaped agriculture. The heavens were a clock, a calendar, and a storybook. One interpretation is that when we talk about star connections at Giza, we are often blending two things. We are blending the mainstream truth that Egyptians cared deeply about celestial symbolism with the modern impulse to search for secret codes. The sky mattered, yes, but not every alignment needs to be a hidden message. And then gently the cinematic what if arrives. What if some of the sky symbolism at Giza is less like a code and more like a lullaby, a repeated pattern of meaning passed down from earlier communities who watched the same stars and told the same kinds of stories long before the pyramids existed. A popular rumour claims the three pyramids mirror the stars of Orion's belt in a precise way, as if the builders copied the sky onto the earth. This idea is widely known in modern discussions, but it is debated. It isn't a settled mainstream conclusion. Some people find the visual comparison compelling. Others point out that the match depends on how you measure which stars you choose and how flexible you are with correspondences. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The pyramids and Orion can be compared as a pattern, but treating that comparison as definite intention goes beyond what the evidence securely demonstrates. It is suggestive to some, not conclusive, and that difference matters for keeping your feet on the solid ground. Most historians agree the constellation Orion had significance in Egyptian thought, often linked to ideas about the afterlife and divine kingship, and archaeology suggests texts and iconography support the importance of certain stars and sky regions. That is your mainstream anchor. The sky mattered, and specific celestial references appear in Egyptian belief. So it is not ridiculous to think the builders cared about star symbolism. The question is how far the symbolism goes in the architecture. Historians still argue whether the placement of the Giza pyramids was intended to replicate a specific star pattern, or whether later observers are seeing a meaningful coincidence in a layout shaped more by terrain and practical constraints. That sentence is your honest bridge. Terrain matters, bedrock matters, construction logistics matter, religious symbolism matters too. Multiple influences can overlap. It is possible that builders aimed for a general cosmic resonance without trying to create a one-to-one map of the night sky. It is also possible that later viewers hungry for patterns project a stronger correspondence than the builders intended. Light joke number 1. Your brain is basically a pattern hunting machine. It sees faces in clouds and animals in toast, so when it sees 3 pyramids, it immediately points at 3 stars and says, "Best friends forever." Sometimes the brain is right. Sometimes the brain just wants companionship. You stand still and imagine a priest or astronomer in the Old Kingdom watching the sky with careful eyes. Not with a telescope, but with patience. He notes when certain stars appear. He notes the way the sky changes through the year. He links those observations to ritual. He links ritual to kingship. In that world, it makes sense to build in ways that echo the heavens. One interpretation is that the pyramid shape itself is already a sky gesture. It is a frozen ray of sunlight, a stable slope reaching upward, a physical reminder of ascent and connection. You do not need an exact star map for the architecture to feel celestial. Now the cinematic What if arrives again slow and soft? What if the sky gestures at Giza are part of a tradition older than royal Egypt? A continuity of sky watching that began with farmers trying to predict floods and seasons, then evolved into sacred ideas about order, then finally became stone. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids were built to transmit information or energy using their alignments functioning like a machine rather than a tomb. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a literal energy machine is thin. Still, the idea is popular because it gives the monument a modern kind of purpose, like it is a device with a hidden function waiting to be activated. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The pyramids can inspire feelings that make machine metaphors tempting, but the evidence we do have points to funerary and ritual contexts. Symbolism can feel powerful without being mechanical. A building can be spiritually meaningful without being a generator. Light joke number 2. If the Great Pyramid is a machine, it is the least user-friendly machine in history. There is no on button, there is no manual, and the warranty period is unfortunately long expired. You keep your gaze on the sky and allow yourself to feel the basic wonder. The stars are distant, the stone is near. Humans built something that still makes humans look up. That loop of attention is real. Even if specific star map claims remain debated, the broader connection between architecture and cosmos is mainstream and well supported. Most historians agree Egyptian monuments often align with cosmic and cardinal principles, and archaeology suggests religious practice wove the heavens into the story of kingship. The evidence we do have points to intentional symbolism, not random placement. One interpretation is that the Orion connection, even if not exact, could function as a poetic resonance. Builders might have wanted a relationship with the sky that feels right, rather than a strict match you could overlay on a modern chart. The layout could reflect a worldview more than a diagram. Now the cinematic what if becomes personal. What if you standing here tonight are participating in the same habit of mind that ancient people had? Looking up, searching for meaning, linking earth and sky. You are not proving anything. You are doing what humans do. You're building a story bridge between what you can touch and what you can only see. Light joke. Number 3. You realize the oldest human hobby might be staring at the sky and saying, I bet that means something, while someone else says it means we should go to bed. You breathe slowly. The night feels calm. The pyramids are quiet. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The mainstream anchor is that celestial symbolism mattered. The interpretation is how directly it shapes Giza's layout. The imagined what if is a soft glow around the idea that older traditions of skywatching could have fed into the later monumental expression. You turn your gaze back down from the stars to the stone. The pyramids remain patient. They do not demand that you solve them. They simply sit there, and in doing so, they allow you to drift in the space between history and wonder where sleep-friendly curiosity can live. You keep walking until the plateau feels less like a single moment in history and more like a layered memory, the way an old neighborhood holds traces of every family that ever lived there. The pyramids do not change, but your perspective does. After hours of slow wandering, you start thinking less about secrets hidden in stone and more about secrets hidden in people, in stories, in the way humans remember hardship and then retell it with extra sparkle. Most historians agree Egypt's survival depended on the Nile's rhythms, and that floods, droughts, and social strain shaped the long arc of its history, and archaeology suggests environmental pressures can leave marks in settlement patterns and cultural shifts. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth. Human societies are not static. They face disruptions. They adapt. They tell stories about what happened, and those stories can last longer than any single record. One interpretation is that when people talk about a lost civilization before the Pharaohs, they sometimes mean a literal advanced society that vanished. But sometimes without realizing it, they are responding to a different possibility. That there were earlier communities and cultures whose details are faint, not because they were magical, but because time is a thief. Wood decays. Mud brick melts back into soil. Villages get rebuilt. Floodplains shift. A whole way of life can leave only scattered hints. And then gently, the cinematic what if arrives. What if the phrase lost civilization is not pointing to a hidden empire, but to the ordinary fact that many early chapters of human life are partly lost to us, and the pyramids, by surviving so dramatically, make those missing chapters feel louder. You slow down and imagine the Nile in a year when things go wrong. The flood comes too low. Fields dry out. Grain stores shrink. People get anxious. Leaders try to maintain order. The calm predictability of the river breaks, and everyone feels the change in their bones. Most historians agree periods of stress can amplify social and religious storytelling, and archaeology suggests societies often encode trauma and disruption into mythic language. The evidence we do have points to legends as more than entertainment. Legends can be memory with metaphor. They can be history filtered through fear and hope. Light joke number one humans are basically walking rumour factories. If it rains twice in 1 week, someone will announce this has never happened before in all of history, and everyone else will nod like they personally interviewed the clouds. Now, in the wider world of pyramid mystery talk, you sometimes hear flood myths or catastrophe narratives used as explanations for why a civilization might vanish. People imagine a great deluge, a sudden collapse, a lost age swept away, leaving only stone monuments as survivors. A fringe idea proposes that Egypt inherited knowledge from survivors of an earlier catastrophic civilization, sometimes linked to global flood legends or a sudden climate disaster. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a single dramatic lost global culture feeding into Old Kingdom Egypt is thin. Still, it persists because it gives the pyramids a dramatic prequel. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is a difference between acknowledging that climates change and societies struggle and claiming that a specific lost advanced civilization must have existed. The first is mainstream and reasonable. The second is a leap that needs strong evidence. And right now, that evidence is not solid in the way the story often implies. Most historians agree pre-dynastic cultures existed in Egypt long before the pharaohs, and archaeology suggests these communities developed agriculture, craft traditions, and social complexity over time. That is an important mainstream anchor. There is nothing empty before the dynasties. There are centuries of growth, experimentation, and cultural formation. So when someone says, before the pharaohs, the true picture is not nothingness. It is a long prelude of human life. One interpretation is that some people call that prelude a lost civilization simply because it feels distant and less visible. Pre-dynastic life leaves different kinds of traces than stone pyramids. It is quieter in the archaeological record. That can create the illusion of a sudden jump, as if Egypt goes from simple villages to giant pyramids overnight. In reality, skills and social organisation can build gradually, and then in one era they express themselves in stone on a massive scale. Historians still argue whether the pace of social and technological development leading into the Old Kingdom should be seen as a smooth progression or as a series of rapid shifts driven by political consolidation and changing environmental pressures. That debate matters because it shapes how you understand the pyramids as a moment. If development is smooth, Giza is a peak of a long climb. If development includes rapid shifts, Giza might represent an intense concentration of power and resources that makes a sudden leap in scale possible. Either way, you do not need a vanished super civilization to explain a society capable of growth and transformation. Light joke number 2. You know how you can ignore a messy room for weeks, and then in one afternoon you clean it all and everyone assumes you have always been organised. Human history can look like that too. The record captures the big cleaning day, not the weeks of slow progress and chaos. You walk slowly and imagine how stories might spread in ancient Egypt. A traveller comes from another region and hears about the king building a mountain of stone. He tells the story in the next town. The next town adds details. Someone says the stones moved like they were alive. Someone says the builders knew secrets from before time. Someone says the king made a deal with the stars. The story grows. Most historians agree oral tradition shapes memory, and archaeology suggests later periods often reinterpret earlier monuments with new myths and meanings. The evidence we do have points to a very human pattern. When something is old and impressive, later people create explanations that match their own worldview. They do not always preserve original intent. They remix it. One interpretation is that the lost civilization idea can function as a modern remix. In a world that loves hidden truths, people frame the pyramids as a mystery story with a secret villain, a secret hero, and a secret technology. But the pyramids are also fully capable of being astonishing without that framing. Now the cinematic what if shifts from catastrophe to something softer. What if the true lost thing is not a civilization wiped out overnight, but everyday knowledge that fades when societies change? A method of moving stone that everyone once knew, a local tradition of surveying, a particular rhythm of work songs, a set of small practices that made big projects possible. Those can vanish without leaving a headline. Light joke number 3. If you ever want to see how quickly knowledge disappears, just try to remember how to set the clock on your microwave without looking up the manual. Now multiply that by 1,000 years and remove the manual. Most historians agree the Nile's rhythms shaped Egyptian stability, and archaeology suggests environmental change and political consolidation influenced how power formed. The evidence we do have points to a long pre-dynastic background, then a dynastic state that can mobilize. That is the mainstream backbone. It is strong. One interpretation is that the phrase lost civilization before the pharaohs might really be a misunderstanding of that long pre-dynastic background. It's possible that early cultures were more complex than some older summaries suggested, and new discoveries can adjust our picture over time. That is not the same as discovering a hidden, advanced empire. It is the normal process of archaeology refining a story. And now gently your cinematic what-if returns to the plateau under your feet. What if the plateau's deeper mystery is not a missing global catastrophe, but the quiet reality that thousands of ordinary lives happened along the Nile before the first pyramid rose, and most of those lives left only faint traces? The pyramids stand as a dramatic survivor, making the earlier chapters feel invisible by comparison. You breathe slowly. The night remains calm. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. And the clue here is that human memory, like sand, shifts. It covers some things, it exposes others, it turns ordinary past into myth, and myth into rumour, and rumour into confident claims if nobody is careful. So you stay careful. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and you let the desert night carry you gently onward toward the next set of questions, without needing a catastrophe to explain why the ancient world can feel from far away like a half-remembered dream. You keep walking with the sense that the plateau is teaching you a lesson in humility, not the dramatic kind, just the quiet kind. The kind where you realize how much of the past is made of ordinary days that nobody wrote down, and how easily a gap in knowledge can turn into a doorway for big stories. Most historians agree that the strongest dating evidence at Giza ties the major monuments to Egypt's Old Kingdom, and archaeology suggests this through the surrounding material culture, construction context, and the broader pattern of Fourth Dynasty activity. The evidence we do have points to a consistent world around the pyramids, a world that looks like Old Kingdom Egypt in its tools, its settlement traces, and its architectural logic. You pause and let that settle, because this section is about limits. Not limits in a sad way, in a soothing way. Limits are boundaries, and boundaries let your mind relax. When you know what you know and what you do not know, you can stop spinning in circles. One interpretation is that people often expect archaeology to work like a movie scene, where someone brushes sand off a stone and suddenly everything is solved. But archaeology is more like piecing together a story from scattered receipts and half-burned notes. You can get a strong picture, but not every detail is preserved. That is why you can have broad agreement and still have debates. Historians still argue whether certain subtle features of the Giza plateau reflect earlier occupation or activity that predates the main pyramid building phase, or whether those impressions are better explained by natural geology later reuse and the normal messiness of long-lived landscapes. You breathe slowly after that sentence because it has a lot of syllables, and your bedtime brain deserves kindness. The idea is simple. The big monuments are old kingdom. The question, if you want to hold one, is whether there are any faint hints of earlier life, or use that do not rewrite the story but add depth. Most historians agree Egypt had pre-dynastic cultures, and archaeology suggests these earlier communities left traces in different places and forms them pyramids. That is a mainstream anchor. Before kings ruled with crowns and carved names, people still lived along the Nile. They made pottery, they buried their dead, they traded, they formed social networks. Their buildings were mostly organic materials and mud brick, not huge stone mountains, so the archaeological signature is different. It is easier to miss. It is easier to lose. One interpretation is that when people ask for evidence of a lost civilization before the pharaohs, they sometimes confuse two separate ideas. One is the real documented pre-dynastic development of Egyptian society. The other is a dramatic hidden civilization story. The first is mainstream. The second is a leap. If you keep them separate, the question becomes more thoughtful and less sensational. Now the cinematic what if arrives soft and credible. What if the lost civilization is not a separate advanced culture, but simply the early Nile world that is harder to see because its everyday materials did not survive like stone? What if much of that life is lost in the sense that it is incomplete, not in the sense that it was technologically futuristic? Light joke number 1, you realise the past is basically a giant group project where everyone forgot to save the file, and now we are reconstructing the presentation from screenshots and vibes. You walk along a patch of ground where the rock shows natural layers, and you think about stratigraphy the way archaeologists read layers of soil and stone like pages. At Giza, the plateau is bedrock. It is not a deep pile of village layers like some ancient city mounds. That means the big monuments are carved and built directly on solid rock, which is great for stability, but it also means earlier smaller traces could be sparse or located elsewhere. Most historians agree that context matters for dating, and archaeology suggests that artifacts and features around a monument often tell you as much as the monument itself. The evidence we do have points to an old kingdom environment at Giza. That is why mainstream scholars remain confident about the general time frame. One interpretation is that this confidence can coexist with curiosity about edges. For example, could earlier quarrying or sacred activity have taken place on the plateau, leaving faint marks? Could earlier paths or small shrines have existed later, erased by major construction? These are plausible questions in principle, but they are hard to answer strongly without clear evidence. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids must be far older because their precision and scale seem beyond their time, and that mainstream dating is wrong by thousands of years. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a dramatically older build is not strong compared to the context-based dating that ties Giza to the Old Kingdom. It remains a popular argument in books and videos because it feels rebellious and exciting. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream dating is not based on one fragile clue. It is based on multiple lines of context that fit together. That does not mean every detail is solved. It means the general frame is robust. If someone wants to shift the date massively, they would need equally robust evidence, not just a feeling of awe. Light joke number 2, awe is not a calendar. You cannot point at something huge and say, therefore it must be 10,000 years old. By that logic, my laundry pile is an ancient monument and should be studied by future civilizations. You keep walking and think about what evidence actually looks like in this kind of landscape. It can be mundane: pottery fragments, tools, work debris, settlement outlines, animal bones, old hearths, cuts in bedrock. It is not always dramatic. Most historians agree that archaeological interpretation depends on material traces, and archaeology suggests the absence of evidence is not automatically evidence of absence, but it also is not a free pass to imagine anything you want. The evidence we do have points to Old Kingdom activity. If earlier traces exist, they would need to be found, documented and compared carefully. Historians still argue whether the gaps in our knowledge about certain construction details and early plateau use reflect true missing evidence or simply the limits of what has been excavated and studied so far. That sentence feels like the desert wind. Gentle, true. Not everything has been excavated. Not every area can be tested in the same way. There are practical limits. There are ethical limits. There are modern realities. So some questions remain open at the edges. One interpretation is that open questions are normal in archaeology. They are not proof of conspiracy or proof of hidden truth. They are the natural result of time and complexity. The past is a puzzle, but it is a puzzle with missing pieces, and you can still see the picture. Now the cinematic what if becomes a quiet bedtime scene. What if somewhere beyond the famous monuments there are still buried traces of earlier life, small and fragile, waiting under sand or in a forgotten corner of the plateau? Not a lost super civilization, just ordinary early people who stood on this rock and looked out at the Nile long before pyramids cast shadows here. Light joke number 3, you imagine some future archaeologist finding your old phone charger and declaring it a sacred serpent cord used in nightly rituals. And you realise how easy it is to overinterpret artifacts when you do not know the context. You breathe slowly and let the main idea settle. The mainstream story stands firm. The pyramids are Old Kingdom projects. The evidence we do have points that way. The interpretation space is about earlier traces and long development. The imagined what if is about the quiet missing chapters of human life that might have happened before the stone mountains rose. You keep walking calm and steady, letting the plateau's silence remind you that not knowing everything is not a failure. It is an invitation to curiosity with boundaries, and boundaries are comforting. They let your mind drift without falling into certainty it does not deserve. You keep moving as the night deepens, and the plateau begins to feel like it has two voices. One voice is stone and measurement, the voice of mainstream history, that says, here is what we can support. The other voice is the softer one, the voice of wonder that says yes, and what about the parts we cannot see? You've been listening to both, but carefully, like you are balancing 2 cups of tea and you do not want to spill either. Most historians agree the pyramids are human achievements rooted in Old Kingdom Egypt, and archaeology suggests the broader Giza landscape fits within a network of royal projects, labour systems and religious ideas. The evidence we do have points to a strong, coherent story. At the same time, the way humans talk about Giza reveals something else. These monuments invite the mind to create extra layers, especially when details remain debated. One interpretation is that the lost civilization narrative survives because it offers a clean answer to messy feelings. If you feel overwhelmed by the scale you reach, for an explanation that matches the emotional impact. A vanished super civilization sounds as big as the pyramids feel, but the emotional match is not the same as an evidential match. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You slow down and let yourself notice the little things again. The sand hush, the warmth held in stone, the faint urban hum far away, the smell of mineral dust, the stars above calm and indifferent. These are the anchors that keep you in the present even while you think about ancient time. Historians still argue whether the most persistent mysteries of Giza are best explained by gaps in evidence and changing interpretations, or whether some unknown factor remains that future discoveries could clarify. That sentence matters because it is honest without being dramatic. There are mysteries. Some are small and technical. Some are broader and cultural. Future discoveries could adjust details, but unknown factor does not automatically mean lost civilization. Unknown can simply mean not yet fully mapped. Now as you walk, you think about how modern eyes shape what we see. People today live in a world of rapid change and short attention spans. We expect big results quickly. We expect technology to do the hard work. So when we face a monument built by time and labour, it can feel alien. Light joke number 1. The Great Pyramid is basically the opposite of a modern app. It has no updates, no pop-ups and no terms of service, but it still demands your attention and somehow wins. Most historians agree ancient Egyptian society valued order, continuity, and cosmic balance, and archaeology suggests this worldview influenced how monuments were designed and how power was expressed. The evidence we do have points to a culture that could commit to a single long project, because the project itself reinforced social cohesion and royal legitimacy. The pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a national statement. One interpretation is that this social function can be mistaken for technological mystery. People ask how did they do it, when sometimes the deeper question is, why did they do it, and how did they persuade so many people to participate? That persuasion, that shared story, is its own kind of power. Now the cinematic what if enters not as a claim about machines, but as a mood about memory. What if the plateau is a place where many generations projected meaning onto stone, so that the monuments became larger than their original context, absorbing older stories, newer stories, and modern stories all at once? A popular rumour claims that mainstream scholars dismiss alternative ideas only to protect a rigid narrative. This rumour is common in modern media, but it does not capture the full reality of how debate works. To be clear, this is debated. Scholars can disagree sharply, and interpretations can shift with new evidence. Mainstream caution is often about standards of proof rather than fear of wonder. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Skepticism is not the enemy of mystery. Skepticism is what keeps mystery from turning into misinformation. You can explore possibilities while still respecting what is broadly accepted. Most historians agree that new methods and ongoing research continue to refine our understanding of ancient sites, and archaeology suggests that even famous monuments can still surprise us with new details. The evidence we do have points to a living field of study, not a closed book. That is a mainstream safe thought. It leaves room for discovery without promising a dramatic hidden truth. One interpretation is that the most likely surprises are not going to be a lost high-tech civilization, but rather a clearer picture of human organization, construction sequencing, and the everyday lives around the monuments. New findings might adjust our understanding of how ramps were managed, how logistics flowed, how different parts of the plateau were used over time. Now the cinematic what if becomes softer and more personal. What if, as you listen tonight, the real lost civilization is the version of humanity that could commit to long projects with slow patience, the version that could build something meant to outlast any single life, and then accept that they would never see its full legacy. Light joke. Number 2, you imagine telling someone today, hey, want to join a project that will take decades, and you might not get a personal credit line, and they immediately ask, does it at least come with free snacks and a good playlist? You walk and let your mind build a balanced conclusion for itself, because this is the section where you start gathering threads. The pyramids are Old Kingdom mainstream safe. The plateau may contain earlier traces, but that is an open question at the edges. The Sphinx erosion debates exist, but they are complicated and do not demand a dramatic rewrite. The star symbolism is real, but exact sky map claims remain debated. The internal features blend function and meaning, and rumours can grow in gaps. A fringe idea proposes that all these mysteries add up to a single hidden story of a pre-pharaonic advanced civilization, and that the pyramids are its last surviving proof. This theory isn't widely accepted, and its strongest weakness is that it often relies on stacking uncertainties into certainty. Uncertainty does not automatically multiply into proof. Sometimes uncertainty just stays uncertainty until evidence arrives. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A pile of questions is not an answer, but a pile of questions can still be a beautiful place to rest your mind as long as you label each question honestly. Light joke. Number 3, your brain loves turning unknowns into a dramatic conspiracy, corkboard. But tonight you are gently telling your brain, please put the red string down and pick up a blanket. You slow your pace and feel the calm return. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues, and the clue you end up holding is this. The pyramids can be fully human, fully Old Kingdom, and still feel like a doorway into deeper time, because human development is long layered and partly lost. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Old Kingdom Egypt had the capacity to build at Giza, supported by archaeology and the broader context. The interpretation part is that earlier cultural roots and possible earlier plateau uses might lie beneath or beyond what we have fully mapped. The imagined part is the soft what if mood, the idea of earlier footsteps, older skywatchers, forgotten work songs, and the long continuity of human hands shaping stone. You keep walking toward the quiet end of the night, letting those layers settle without fighting, like sand settling after a footstep. You can hold wonder without grabbing certainty. You can enjoy mystery without being misled by it. And as you approach the final stretch, you let your breathing slow, because the plateau has done its job. It has given you a steady place to rest your mind. You keep walking, and the plateau feels quieter now, as if it senses you are nearing the end of your long night out here. The pyramids are still behind you, heavy and calm, and the Sphinx is somewhere off to the side, keeping its old watch. The sky has shifted almost imperceptibly. The stars are still there, but the night feels thinner at the edges. Like dawn is a rumour the horizon has started to consider. Most historians agree the pyramids of Giza are masterpieces of Old Kingdom Egypt, and archaeology suggests their construction reflects human labour administration and religious meaning woven into one monumental landscape. The evidence we do have points to a story that is strong and coherent. And yet, as you stand here in the open, you can also feel why the question persists. Evidence of a lost civilization before the Pharaohs, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling, a way of naming the parts of the past we do not fully recover. One interpretation is that the phrase lost civilization is often less about a separate advanced empire and more about the long shadow of incomplete knowledge. There were people before dynasties, and their lives are harder to see. There were earlier traditions of work and sky watching, and their beginnings are not always neatly documented. There were practical details of construction, like the exact ramp strategies, that remain debated. These gaps can invite imaginative answers. Historians still argue whether the remaining mysteries at Giza primarily reflect the limits of surviving evidence, or whether future discoveries could significantly reshape our understanding of certain features and timelines. You hold that sentence softly because it is honest without being dramatic. Limits exist. Discoveries can happen, but the mainstream frame remains sturdy. The pyramids belong to a known cultural world. The plateau is part of a documented ancient society. That is your solid ground. And now gently, you let the mist return in its safest form. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not at a hidden super civilization with impossible machines, but at the layered nature of human life. Places get reused, skills get inherited, symbols get reinterpreted. The past is not a single clear line, it is a braid, and some strands are easier to see than others. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids are the last surviving monuments of a pre-pharaonic advanced culture, later claimed by Egyptian kings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for such a dramatic rewrite remains thin compared to the context that ties Giza to the Old Kingdom. Still, the idea persists because it feels like a satisfying secret. It turns uncertainty into certainty. It turns wonder into a single answer. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Wonder is allowed. Curiosity is healthy, but certainty should match evidence. The evidence, we do have points to Old Kingdom builders using practical methods guided by strong organisation and symbolic purpose. The open questions are real, but they are mostly about details development and the long prelude of human life along the Nile. Light joke number 1, and it is a gentle one. If ancient Egypt had left us a giant instruction manual titled How We Built This Volume 1, we would still argue about it on the internet, and someone would still say the manual is fake. You slow your breathing and imagine the plateau in layers like the earth itself is a storybook. At the surface, you have the monuments everyone recognises. Beneath the surface, you have the bedrock that was cut and shaped and the quarry marks that show labour. Beyond the monuments, you have the worker towns and bakeries and administration that make the project human. Beyond that, you have the pre-dynastic centuries, quieter and less visible, but not empty. One interpretation is that the most responsible way to hold the lost civilization question is to treat it as a prompt rather than a verdict. A prompt that asks what earlier roots fed into this moment, what earlier traditions of measurement and sky watching helped prepare the ground, what earlier communities used this landscape before it became a royal stage. And now the cinematic what if arrives as a closing image. What if long before any king's name was spoken at Giza, someone stood on this same rock and watched the sunrise, watched the stars and felt the same quiet awe you feel now? Not because they had secret technology, but because humans have always been capable of wonder, and wonder is one of the oldest tools we have. Light joke number 2, you realise the lost civilization might just be the version of humanity that could stare at the sky for hours without checking a phone. Honestly, that might be the rarest power of all. You let the night hold you for one more moment. The pyramids do not ask you to pick a side in every debate. They simply exist. They are old and they are human and they are large enough to carry both the solid ground and the mist without collapsing. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation and some are gentle imagination. You take a final slow look at the Great Pyramid's silhouette. You think about the workers, the planners, the surveyors, the bakers, the rope makers. You think about the king who wanted eternity and the society that tried to build it. You think about later generations who found the monuments already old and added their own stories. You think about modern minds, including yours, that stand here and still feel the tug of the unknown. Light joke number 3. You promise yourself you will never again complain about carrying groceries upstairs because somewhere deep in your soul an ancient ramp maintenance worker is watching and judging you. Now the wind down begins and you let your thoughts soften. You do not need sharp edges anymore. You let sentences stretch out like a long exhale. The desert air is cool now, and the stone is slowly releasing the last warmth of the day, the way a blanket releases warmth after you stand up from it. The sand hush under your shoes becomes slower, quieter, until it almost disappears because you are not trying to go anywhere anymore. You are simply standing and letting the night settle. You imagine the plateau from far above a wide pale surface, with 3 dark geometric shapes resting on it, and one long lion body carved from bedrock and faint lines, where temples and causeways once guided motion toward meaning. You imagine the Nile beyond moving steadily through the darkness, continuing in the work it has always done, carrying water, carrying silt, carrying life. And you let the question linger in the gentlest way. Evidence of a lost civilization before the Pharaohs. Maybe the evidence is not a hidden machine or a secret archive, but the simple fact that human history is deeper than any one monument, and that the earliest chapters are often quiet. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And sometimes the best clue is the feeling of standing in a place where time has layers and realizing you can rest in that layered silence without demanding an answer. Your breathing slows and your shoulders drop and your jaw loosens, and you can almost hear your own thoughts becoming softer, like they are turning into sand and drifting away. The pyramids remain patient as ever, holding their angles against the sky, not shouting, not insisting, just letting you be small and safe beneath something enormous. So you let the final image be simple: a calm horizon, a steady sky, stone shapes that have watched countless nights. And you hear for one night, letting history and possibility and gentle imagination fade into a quiet, comfortable hum.